Hey everybody, welcome to another video episode of OK Talks. I'm your host, Oliver Kendall. I'm a lifelong political nerd with a background in international relations and security policy who's worked in domestic US politics and also had the good fortune to have visited and gotten to live in a number of countries besides just my own. Channeling those experiences, I do my best on this show to both translate what's going on in my own country for my non-US listeners and to help shed some light for the folks back home on some events of note going on in the rest of the world. So, this last week, I was writing an episode that could be summarized, I guess, as Normie Democrats Strike Back. And I am still going to talk at some point about everything that I plan to around the recent defeat in a primary election of Congressman Jamal Bowman. But it looks like that's going to happen in a separate episode because enough huge political things have happened since that primary last Tuesday that I feel like it would be kind of insane for me to not also talk about these other things. But then combining them all together with that planned episode from last week would be just like way too much. So we're going to take the multiple episode approach. So first I have to mention, and how appropriate that I just cleared my throat there. First I have to mention the presidential debate last Thursday because it is on everyone's mind and also certainly has been on mine. So in the wee hours of the morning after that, well, let's be realistic about it, that unmitigated clusterfuck, I recorded a reaction to the debate with my fellow Democrat abroad, Robert Girard, the last episode of OK Talks, which you can listen to if you're curious and haven't already. My feelings and thoughts on the debate and the fallout from it are still evolving, and the impact is still being determined, so I don't want to go too much further into that topic yet, other than to leave you with one question in the aftermath of that debate, and it is this. Can you imagine for 1 second the Republicans throwing their candidate under the bus after a bad debate performance? Rather than deeply ponder that question right now, I'm going to instead go into the main topic of this episode, which I'm hoping to have be maybe a bit briefer than I sometimes do, since the conclusions are still being drawn about the implications of what I'm talking about. And also, I am not a lawyer, which makes me always want to be at least a little bit cautious when talking about legal stuff. But with that caveat aside, I cannot help myself from doing this quick check-in on the recent malign activities of the Supreme Court. And there have been a number of huge decisions rendered recently by the court, any one of which could merit its own episode, and I may yet do others. But for now, I wanted to just put this in front of my audience to make sure that the antics of this lunatic Supreme Court remain clearly in focus. So the first and probably craziest Supreme Court story, I think most of the folks listening to OK Talks will have already heard. The supermajority of Republican operatives on the Supreme Court in yet another 6-3 ruling aimed at protecting Donald Trump from the prosecutions he so richly deserves, have now ruled that a president is basically immune from prosecution for crimes they committed as part of an official act, which is a little murky, but my understanding is that realistically, this does actually mean that the president can maybe send a SEAL team to go shoot their political opponents in the face. I wouldn't be comfortable using that specific analogy just on my own, but I'm pretty sure one of the 3 remaining sane justices on the court actually said something along those lines in their dissent, and a number of elected officials have also used that analogy. So it's not just coming from Oliver the non-lawyer. This is nuts. I mean, this is not okay. I mean, even Vladimir Putin has to at least pretend that he didn't have the apparatus of the state murder Alexei Navalny and Boris Nemtsov and all the others. This is something that I maybe should explore in more depth on another podcast episode once more has been written about the full implications of this immunity thing. But I had to at least mention this here since it's breaking, and since I'm talking about how the Supreme Court, as it's currently constituted, is a clear and present danger to the survival of the United States as we know it. Now, before I continue, it feels like a horrible transit, like a fiddle while Rome burns level of non sequitur, but the hell with it. I already started, may as well plow on. If you haven't already done so, please do be sure to subscribe to the channel, and also if you wouldn't mind hitting like and leaving a comment, I would really appreciate it. And most of all, please do share this with anybody that you think might get something out of it, or just anybody who likes to have predictions of doom in the background while folding the laundry or something. Thanks to those who already have, thanks in advance to anyone else who will. So getting back to the aforementioned doom, In another case that's at least somewhat related to the whole Trump immunity thing, the court ruled in a way, in another case recently, that basically is favorable to a certain batch of January 6th insurrectionist defendants who have gotten into trouble for, the whole attack on the Capitol thing. And here it bears mentioning, related both to their ruling on the idea of Trump being at least somewhat immune for crimes he committed, especially around January 6th, and this other January 6th verdict that was like way more coddly toward the insurrectionists. It's worth mentioning that the wives of both Justice Clarence Thomas and Justice Samuel Alito were, to varying degrees, like openly in support of the insurrection. I mean, there's the whole like recently revealed weird drama about Mrs. Alito's like subtweets via flagpole feud with the neighbor. And then there's what we already knew about Clarence Thomas's nutcase right-wing activist wife Ginny being like actively involved with a whole bunch of the planners of the failed coup and texting them about having the Biden crime family arrested and put on barges in international waters to then do who knows what with them. And yet, neither of those men, neither Thomas nor Alito, seemed to feel that they needed to in any way distance themselves from this case in which their immediate family members were, again, to varying degrees, like personally involved. So another very bad thing done by the Supreme Court recently, understandably got far less attention than the immunity one, but will have, I think, similarly devastating impacts in terms of our ability to function as a relatively well-run democracy. They struck down a low-profile but extremely important legal precedent called Chevron deference. Now, again, not a lawyer, so I'm not going to go too far into this, but just so people have an idea what happened here, in case you want to look more into it yourselves, or maybe as a preference to a hypothetical future episode, what is, or I guess what was, the Chevron deference? So, for decades, the legal precedent that we've been operating under was that if Congress passes a law empowering a regulatory agency to, regulate stuff, part of the basic functioning of any modern government, Congress, would leave the details to the professionals at the agency in question. That is to say, if Congress passes a law creating an agency to regulate what goes into food and medicine in America to make sure that what's being sold and consumed is safe, some sort of Food and Drug Administration, one might call it, Congress empowers them to regulate those things and defers to the experts at the Food and Drug Administration when it comes to the specifics, rather than Congress needing to actually spell out in the original law all of the granular details of what they can regulate, grounded in the obvious assumption that the 535 members of Congress do not have the wherewithal or responsibility to micromanage the entire administrative and regulatory bureaucracy. So let's say that a food company is putting some new chemical in their, I don't know, it's almost 4th of July. Let's say hot dog buns. And the FDA says, hold up, that chemical might not be safe. You need to not include that in your hot dog buns, at least until we know that it's safe. So for the last many decades, the food company in question would then need to take that chemical out of their product until it could be determined that it's safe. Or they could try to sue the FDA to get them to let the company do whatever it wants, and based on the precedent set by the Chevron deference, well, the judge in that case would almost certainly say, LOL, get the fuck out of my courtroom and let the FDA do its job. But now, well, that food company, as far as I understand it, can way more easily just bring a lawsuit against the FDA saying, well, technically there's no law against using this new chemical in our hot dog buns because it hadn't been invented when the law was written. And so then there will actually have to be a court case around this individual thing where a court is much more actively involved in determining the safety of a chemical rather than the regulatory professionals whose job it is to do that. Obviously, this has the effect of shifting the burden massively in favor of corporations and away from the federal regulatory agencies that are working to protect people. Because, think about this. The U.S. is already, in a lot of ways, just way less well-regulated than virtually all other developed countries. I mean, I could go on a tangent here about how Most of the world, for example, limits the use of antibiotics in the agriculture industry on the idea that just dumping antibiotics into the food supply almost certainly contributes to the future existential crisis of antibiotic resistance. Whereas in the US, something like 80% of all antibiotics are used in agriculture. But I'll spare you that tirade about America's collective allergy to practical regulations. Just like, think about this: food, medicine, the environment, transportation, insurance, the stock market, working conditions. There are plenty more. But those are a few areas just off the top of my head where federal regulatory agencies play a critical role in protecting people in America from the corporations, from corporations that have every incentive, let's be realistic, to increase their margins by putting crap in the food, dumping coal into the water table, selling shitty financial products that crash the economy, screwing you out of insurance coverage, neglecting their workers' safety, or selling you an airplane where the door falls off. And the agencies which exist to protect people from those things, the agencies, I should say, by the way, which are almost to a one, understaffed and underfunded, kept afloat by hardworking professionals who could usually make a hell of a lot more money if they switched teams and worked in the private sector, and who also, by the way, have increasingly over the years been put in serious personal financial jeopardy by Republicans throwing temper tantrums and shutting down the government, which then causes these folks to be indefinitely furloughed without pay, as I discuss in, I believe, episode 52 of OK Talks, in case you're curious to learn more about that. Those agencies, which are, as I say, already stretched thin, will now have to try and do their critically important jobs while fending off and inevitably getting bogged down in lawsuits brought by the corporations and special interests that they are tasked with trying to regulate. Corporations which, by the way, inevitably have vastly more resources to throw at those hypothetical lawsuits than the agencies do. Do you really want the organization that's responsible for keeping salmonella out of your chicken, or industrial runoff from leaching into your drinking water, or planes from falling out of the sky, having to devote a bunch of its resources to fending off stupid lawsuits brought by Purdue or DuPont or Boeing? Well, the Republican operatives on the Supreme Court, I'm sorry, I mean Justices Thomas, Alito, Roberts, Gorsuch, Kavanaugh, and Barrett, apparently do. They apparently also think that civilians should be able to buy a device called a bump stock that effectively turns a semi-automatic rifle into an automatic one, or what normal people who aren't nerds about guns to the same absurd degree that I am call a machine gun. I mentioned this because a couple weeks ago, they also struck down the one meager regulation that restricted the sale of this little gizmo that even the Trump administration realized they had to enact after a guy used one to shoot up a country music festival in Nevada. I bring that one up because it's just one more data point that indicates that this Supreme Court, which, I also need hardly remind my audience, 2 years ago, knocked over a half-century precedent that protected a woman's right to not be forced to carry an unwanted pregnancy to term, has opened the door to unrestricted partisan gerrymandering and a whole bunch of other very bad things, that this Supreme Court, 5/9 of whom were appointed by presidents who lost the popular vote, 3 specifically by a president who was elected with the help of an enemy military intelligence agency and is now a convicted felon. Okay. I bring it up because it's one more data point that indicates that this court seems intent on basically repealing the 20th century. And this is something that should focus the mind of anyone who doesn't want to see that happen or claims to not want to see that happen. I include the last clause of that sentence because it is irresponsible, I think, to talk about how terrible the current Supreme Court is without reminding everyone of how we got it. And how is that again? Well, a full 1/3 of this Supreme Court, as I just mentioned, was appointed by Donald Trump when it should have been, and easily could have been, appointed instead by Hillary Clinton. Now, I've done other episodes, where I discuss 2016 and various reasons why Hillary Clinton lost despite winning 3 million votes. Episode 51 in particular, if memory serves, if anybody's curious. So I'm not going to spin this whole episode off into a rehashing of the 2016 election or an enumeration of all the various factors that went wrong that year. Because one of those factors is relevant in particular to the point that I'm making right now, and it is this. Although there are multiple reasons that Donald Trump was elected president in 2016 instead of Hillary Clinton, one of them is undeniably that the far left was radicalized against Hillary Clinton in the primary and chose, egged on, by the way, by the antics of clowns like Jill Stein and the information warfare operation carried out by the Russian military intelligence services, chose to sit out the general election rather than being forced to choose between the lesser of two evils. And people sometimes allow themselves to forget that, like it or not, and I am multiple times on the record as not liking it, but it is just the reality. Politics is a binary choice in America. The right has usually remembered that, like, for a long time, specifically vis-a-vis the court. Like the slow plotting campaign over the last several decades to overturn the right to choose in America. As I say, it took a very long time, but during those decades, it got conservatives consistently out to the polls to vote for candidates that they may not have loved, but that they understood would appoint justices to the bench who would help them to enact their agenda. The left, meanwhile, has often just not noticed that reality, with 2016 being the most painfully obvious example, because I can't imagine almost anyone who chose to not vote for Hillary because of her supposed insufficient purity from a progressive perspective is now particularly happy about the Supreme Court decisions on abortion rights or bump stocks or any of the number of other horrible 6-3 decisions that keep rolling in. But anyone who did anything in 2016 besides vote for Hillary Clinton, I'm sorry, owns this legacy. Sometimes it's easy to forget, but these are the stakes in an American presidential election, which, as I was starting to say earlier, should rather focus the mind of voters this November, at least the minds of voters who look at the behavior of this Supreme Court and see a problem. And it should do that. It should focus the mind of those hypothetical voters for two reasons. One, because Clarence Thomas and Sam Alito are at least a bit old, or at least old enough that they would probably retire if Donald Trump wins in order to give Trump the opportunity to have filled 5/9 of the Supreme Court and thus locking in a fascist majority for decades to come. And two, because the Supreme Court has basically just announced that whoever the president is can effectively do whatever they want without consequences. And some people aren't satisfied with the Biden presidency to date. Debate. Excellent Freudian slip there. But some people are not satisfied with the Biden presidency to date, despite this having been unequivocally the most productive and progressive presidency since the late 1960s, if not the 1940s. In the face, by the way, of unprecedented obstacles. A lot of people, in addition, a lot of people on the further left end of the party aren't satisfied and, trash Biden for being too milquetoast and moderate, just as happened with FDR and LBJ, by the way. Also, a very small poll show, but very vocal, misguided minority are making it very clear that they're very dissatisfied that President Biden has not single-handedly upended 75 years worth of American foreign policy vis-a-vis the Middle East and didn't throw a close ally and the world's only Jewish state under the bus after it was viciously attacked in the worst mass slaughter of Jews since the Holocaust. Some may have other policy quibbles with the Biden presidency so far. Others might have just been alarmed by President Biden's frankly terrible debate performance the other day and or worried that he's too old. Okay, granted. Here's the thing, though. On both of those points that I mentioned a few minutes ago, the point about appointments to the Supreme Court and the fact that the president, per that court, can now basically do whatever they want, a second Donald Trump term in office should be completely intolerable to anyone who is at any point left of far right, or really anyone who just believes in the basic concept of American democracy. And if you are one of those people, there is no choice but to vote for the Democratic nominee, the only non-Donald Trump person who can viably win the election this fall. And we have to assume that that person will be Joe Biden. And anyone who does anything besides vote for Joe Biden this November owns whatever crazy, dangerous shit a totally unshackled, totally immune Donald Trump does in a second term, and owns whatever insane democracy-destroying decisions are handed down by his future Supreme Court appointments. Because Joe Biden could literally be asleep 23 hours a day. He could be in a fucking fugue state. And he and his administration still would never nominate the kinds of right-wing, let's be real, borderline fascist cranks that now sit in 6 of the 9 seats on the nation's highest court. And when it comes, by the way, to that whole presidential immunity thing, well, not to put too fine a point on it, but when folks go to vote this November, there's really only one question they should ask themselves, and it is this. Of the 2 choices on the ballot, and yes, again, there are only 2 choices, of the 2 guys on the ballot, which one would be less likely to officially send a SEAL team to blow your head off for making fun of him on the internet? Vote accordingly, people.